Hi all, so today's video is looking at the poem First Death in Nova Scotia by Elizabeth Bishop. So just to start off, the poem deals with the death of Bishop's cousin as a child. Okay, so it is based on a true experience. Now in the poem the child is named Arthur. To my knowledge the child's name was actually Frank. This is just one of the... It is so still, while it's still a personal poem, there is an aspect of Bishop separating herself, keeping her own life private. But anyway, before we go into this, I want to think, have you studied any other poems, maybe in junior cycle, that deal with a theme similar to this, to deal with death, family death or death of a child? And how do these poems deal with such a difficult theme? So maybe just have a think about that for 1 or 2 minutes. So the poem I'm kind of hinting at here, that most people will have studied in junior cycle, is the poem Midterm Break by Seamus Heaney. So in that poem, Heaney, the narrator of the poem returns home from school because his 4-year-old brother has been killed in a car accident. He's been hit by a car, and he kind of describes the process of, you know, going into the house where everyone's mourning the child and seeing the brother in the coffin and things like that. But we see that a huge amount of metaphor and imagery are used in this kind of description because it's such a difficult theme to actually discuss death, especially when it's in relation to a child. The poets tend to talk about quite metaphorically and use a lot of imagery and colour come into it. And so these are things we're kind of expecting to see in this poem by Bishop. The picture in front of you at the moment is a picture of a loon. You'll see in a second when we read the poem why I've chosen that picture. Okay. So, the poem itself. In the cold, cold parlour, my mother laid out Arthur beneath the chromographs, Edward, Prince of Wales, with Princess Alexandra, and King George with Queen Mary. Below them on the table stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. He kept his own counsel on his white, frozen lake, the marble-topped table. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. "Come," said my mother, "come and say goodbye to your little cousin Arthur." I was lifted up and given one lily of the valley to put in Arthur's hand. Arthur's coffin was a little frosted cake, and the red-eyed loon eyed it from his white, frozen lake. Arthur was very small. He was all white, like a doll that hadn't been painted yet. Jack Frost had started to paint him the way he always painted, the maple leaf, forever. He had just begun on his hair, a few red strokes, and then Jack Frost had dropped the brush and left him white, forever. The greatest royal couples were warm in red and ermine. Their feet were well wrapped up in the ladies' ermine trains. They invited Arthur to be the smallest page at court, but how could Arthur go, clutching his tiny lily, with his eyes shut up so tight, and the roads deep in snow? Okay, so to start off, I want to think, what colours stand out to you from this poem, and why might these be important? And then, do you notice any important poetic techniques being used here? Okay, so I'm going to switch back onto the poem in a second. Now you need to pause the video here, read through the poem 3-4 times at least, and really just come to a good familiarity of what's going on in the poem, good understanding of the language, and come up with an answer to those questions before we go into our deeper analysis. Okay, so you can pause here and just read through the poem a few more times. Okay, so what colours stand out? The colours that are mainly going to stand out to people are basically white and red. Okay, so we have the white in the lily and the frosted cake, and then we have the red in the loon, in the eyes of the loon, and in the cheeks of the child. And we'll go into all of the meanings behind those colours in a few minutes. Okay, but you should have those colours as central images to the poem as we read through it. Other techniques you might have noticed is there's quite a lot of repetition going on in here. There's quite a lot of symbolism and metaphor going on. Okay, there's a number of important techniques going on throughout the poem. Alright, but let's get straight into analysis now. So first, in those first two stanzas, I'm just going to read through them and look at 3 questions in front of you then. So, in the cold, cold parlour, my mother laid out Arthur beneath the chromographs, Edward, Prince of Wales, with Princess Alexandra and King George with Queen Mary. Below them on the table stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. He kept his own counsel on his white, frozen lake, the marble-topped table. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. Right, so these are possibly not the most straightforward of stanzas to start off a poem with. Okay, you'll notice in the first stanza we're being brought into the room where the child Arthur, is laid out in his coffin. Right, and the description goes into then. She starts describing pictures that she sees above the coffin. So there's pictures of Edward, Prince of Wales, Princess Alexandra, so the royal family hanging above the coffin. So that's what's going on there, and that's just showing what the child's eye is drawn to. Then the second stanza, what she's describing the loon, so the stuffed bird. That was the bird in the picture at the start of the video, and that's what the description is going on here. So just try and follow the story of what's going on in the poem, because basically it's written in stream of consciousness to an extent, so we're just following the thought process of the child narrator. Right, so you do have to be aware of what's going on and what this all, look in a second at why it's following these particular thoughts. But read through these 2 stanzas again. I want to come to an answer for the following 3 questions. So why does the poet repeat cold in the first line? Do you notice any other language which connects with the word cold? And what is the poet describing in the second stanza? I'm actually after just giving you the answer to that one. Alright, we can pause here and read through these stanzas. Okay, so the word cold is being repeated here because this is association with death, and this is the thing that the child seems to be noticing upon being brought into the room where her cousin's body is laid out, is the coldness within the room. That's the first thing that kind of hits the child. And then we see how she gets distracted and maybe intentionally allows her thought process to go to other things, as possibly an avoidance measure of dealing with the death of the child. Right? Because it's such a difficult thing to deal with, especially for a young child to try and deal with it and try to comprehend it and understand the meaning of what death is. So the coldness represents that death and brings us as readers into that kind of mood of grief. Alright? And then we can maybe understand why the child's mind is going off in different directions. We may notice here some of the words that are going to stand out as being connected to that coldness. You will see the word the white frozen lake down the middle of the second stanza. Is cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass. All of these are very cold images. There's also the silence. He hadn't said a word, come across as being quite cold. And as I said already, the poet is describing the loon with the stuffed bird in the second stanza, but there is very much a dark connection between the loon and the body of the child. Okay, so a few notes along this section. So the repetition of cold in the opening line establishes a sense of lacking and loss. So we're brought immediately into a sense of discomfort by the repetition of the cold. Sorry, I forgot to put arrows into this in along here, but I'll show you where I'll speak out where they're going to. Okay, the childish narrative is emphasised by the focus on the old photographs. Okay, so the chromographs they are photographs. There is an avoidance of Arthur at the beginning. Okay, the images also highlight the theme of family. You'll see later in the poem that the narrator is wishing Arthur to be welcomed into a new family now that he has been taken away from his actual family. In terms of techniques, there's assonance here in the repetition of the vowel sounds. In the stud, stuffed, shot, stuffed. Those long vowels coming across, and there's alliteration of the T sound, and all of this brings a kind of harsh reality to death. But it's in relation to the loon, and this seems to be how the child is coming to understand death and the situation she's in is in relation to the loon rather than directly to her cousin. The child's eye is focused on the loon, perhaps it's a more comfortable death for her to come to terms with what we just said. There's also a macabre kind of association between the stuffed loon and the body of the child. There seems to be a connection between the two of them. Rather than describing the body of the child, she decides to describe the loon instead. The loon seems to be a witness to the scene, observing what's going on. Okay, so it seems to be a connection that the child has with the objects within the room in terms of how she understands it. And she seems to have see the loon as being an active observer of what's going on. The cold imagery is prevalent throughout the description of the loon that's on its frozen lake, the marble top table, the cold and festival, and the red glass. All of this kind of coldness, she describes it from the loon, but you can see that probably connects with the body of the child at the same time. Okay, so moving on then into the next two stanzas. "Come," said my mother, "come and say goodbye to your little cousin Arthur." I was lifted up and given one lily of the valley to put in Arthur's hand. Arthur's coffin was a little frosted cake, and the red-eyed loon eyed it from his white, frozen lake. Arthur was very small. He was all white, like a doll, that hadn't been painted yet. Jack Frost had started to paint him, the way he always painted, the maple leaf, forever. He had just begun on his hair, a few red strokes, and then Jack Frost dropped the brush and left him white forever. So a few questions here. Colour imagery is very important in these stanzas. What colours are really being emphasised? And then how does Bishop show the innocence of childhood in these stanzas? Okay, so pause here for 1 or 2 minutes, read through those two stanzas again, and come to some answers to those two questions. Okay, so these colours are coming across, because we said already, this white and the red, so you can see that they're being set up in direct contrast to each other here. Okay, so you have the lily of the valley and the frosted cake both being probably coming across as white. And the frosted cake could be referring to the lining of the coffin, which tends to be kind of a frilled lining that comes off the outside, it comes out over the edge of the coffin, and as she sees that as being like the frosting you would see on a cake. It's very innocent kind of imagery for a child to bring the comparison in. Then we're immediately brought into red-eyed loons. We see the redness coming in, okay, and then back to the white, okay. So the redness there is the sense of possibility of life, possibility of growing up, but it's totally surrounded by the paleness and the whiteness. Okay, and this could be these colours are brought into the child as well. So the child has red hair. We'll see that down in the second stanza up here. So he had begun his hair a few strokes red. The child has red hair, but the whiteness representing the paleness of him having of the body. The emphasis or the innocence of the child is emphasised in a number of different ways. We have the lily of the valley as a symbol of purity and therefore innocence. Okay, we also have this idea down those last few lines, he had begun in his hair, that this child's life had only just begun and been cut so short so quickly. There's the simile comparing the body to a doll, right? And then there is the use of Jack Frost's kind of childish fairy tale in to help the narrator use in understanding what's going on. Okay, so a few notes along this section. So as I said, the lily of the valley symbolises the purity and innocence of childhood, linked with the image of the narrator being lifted by her mother. It continues to emphasise the tragedy of the child's death and the narrative death of Arthur as a child, but also the child trying to understand death. Okay, so it's very much bringing death into the world of the child, showing how tragic such a topic is. When we see the narrator being picked up by her mother, we imagine that's what the imagery of what Arthur should be experiencing as well, being picked up by their parent. The metaphor of the coffin as cake emphasises the childish view. Okay, lots of imagery here is a very childish way of describing things. Okay, especially in terms of what the subject matter. Adults would never describe this type of a topic in such a innocent way, or such a go and compare cake to a coffin. It just won't. It's not the kind of imagery that would be appropriate perhaps for adults to use. But this, because it's a child narrator, she can use this, and it just highlights her innocence and her lack of understanding of what's going on. Typical of Bishop, the imagery is unusual, but it can be quite uncomfortable in this poem, because the poem is going to be uncomfortable anyway based on the subject matter. But then this, the innocence of how it's described is really quite heartbreaking at the same also. It's easy to track the colour imagery here, as elsewhere in the poem. We have the white lily, the frosted cake, the frozen lake. We can also see the importance of repetition, so the frozen lake comes up a number of times, okay, and that brings in the coldness of what's going on as well, okay, the cold feeling, this frozen lake. The allusion to the story of Jack Frost, as we mentioned, shows that the child is trying to make sense of death. Bishop regularly uses nature and the seasons to describe different aspects of life and death in her poems. Okay, so when we're looking at drawing comparisons between different poems by Bishop, this is one of those aspects, along with the unusual imagery. The use of nature for this to represent life and death is also something we can bring up. Then also the maple leaf and the loon are both symbols connected to Canada. Okay, so the maple leaf was the national symbol of Canada, and the loon is a bird which is, I believe, associated with one of the provinces of Canada. But they're both very Canadian kind of images, and these symbols may help to bring a sense of personality, make the poem seem more personal to Bishop. Okay, that and a connection, like, it is a true story, it is based on a real experience, okay, but it's just those personal touches being brought into it. Then finally onto the final stanza. The gracious royal couples were warm in red and ermine, their feet were well wrapped up in the ladies' ermine trains. They invited Arthur to be the smallest page at court, but how could Arthur go, clutching his tiny lily with his eyes shut up so tight, and the road steep in snow? So what is the function of mentioning the pictures of the royalty in this stanza, and what does the narrator imagine for Arthur? So again, pause here for a few minutes, read through the stanza and come to an answer to those two questions. So the image, or say the pictures here, they're pictures of family, and so perhaps we can see that this family and their presence is offering some comfort to the child, and that she hopes her little cousin Arthur will be united with this family and therefore have people to care for him, even though he's died. This links in then with the ermine. So ermine is a type of fur, and that lends to warmth. Okay, so we see we're warm, the grace couple were warm. So perhaps, even though things are cold right now, Arthur will be able to have warmth in his life and comfort by being with this family. So you can see hope for Arthur and kind of a clutching at some kind of sense of an afterlife and comfort for Arthur coming from the narrator. And therefore she imagines kind of a greatness in that Arthur will be brought into a royal court, so positives and greatness in Arthur's future in the afterlife, but also a sense of comfort in that he's going to meet up with a new family, and therefore he won't be alone as such. Okay, so a few notes then on this section. We see the child's wish for her cousin to have companionship and a sense of family and belonging when she wants him to be welcomed by royalty in the picture of the coffin. The pictures above the coffin. So all of this, that's this idea of the royalty, those pictures can be a little bit confusing. It's mainly to do with the idea of family and that connection and Arthur being raised up. The clutching his tiny lily really emphasises, that idea of clutching it, the helplessness of this child. Okay, and, it's a very, very difficult image to kind of deal with the death of this helpless child. The feeling of the poem changes here as the ermine or the fur worn by the royals resembles the warmth which the poet hopes for her cousin. Okay, so by the end of the poem, it's been very, very cold throughout the poem. There's a hope for warmth here at the end, and the poem ends with a sense of childish confusion about death, as the poet wonders how Arthur will get to court when he is lying asleep and the roads outside are covered in snow. Okay, so perhaps this is a confusion. The child doesn't really understand death and what's happening to her cousin. She's hoping for him to be able to go somewhere, but doesn't understand the concept of spirituality and that he won't be physically going. Okay, so she's wondering, how is he going to go? He's asleep. It's snowing outside. How will he be able to get there? Okay, so and that highlights again the tragedy of what's going on here, and just the child's inability to understand it. Okay, so overall themes from this poem are family. Okay, again, just keep coming up in the poems we look at from Bishop. Death is hugely important, as is innocence. childhood, and again back to the concept of home. All very, very important themes in this poem. We see Bishop's technique of using unusual comparisons once again. Okay, these particularly standing out. The coffin is a frosted cake. This can be quite uncomfortable in the poem due to the subject matter of a child's death. However, it lends itself well to the persona of a child narrator. Okay, we can see that this perhaps how it is really, it's a realistic way of how a child might deal with such a difficult concept. The cold imagery hints that the child seems at least partially aware of the finality of death. Okay, just focus on the coldness. Okay, there is definitely an awareness. Perhaps it's unsure how deep an understanding there is, but it's most definitely an awareness of the coldness and the finality of death through that. A pathetic fallacy is used in the poem as the snow outside reflects the mood in the parlour. This is actively important to our understanding of the poem as Jack Frost enters the room to paint Arthur. There's a lot of pathetic fallacy going on there. Okay, so task for today, I want you to choose one of the questions to answer. So write half an A4 page in response to it. So 1, do you find the imagery in this poem effective? And 2, has the poet created an engaging or relatable narrative voice here? So choose one of those two and half an A4 page in response to it.